Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to rebuild a Showa shock that has the horizontal style of bladder. This shock came off a 2019 CRF250RX and we need to rebuild it. We had a ton of oil blowing out. It's all over the back end of our bike. So if you have this happen to your shock, you want to get it rebuilt as soon as possible, and that way the shock will function correctly. Now, as far as fitment goes, this is going to be a similar procedure for any of the 250s or 450s that have the Showa shock with that horizontal style of bladder. Just make sure you refer to your model-specific service manual for more information and specs. Now, as far as this style goes, it's a little bit different bleeding procedure than a standard rear shock that has the vertical bladder. So we'll show you how to do that as well as get this thing rebuilt. So let's go ahead and jump into it. To do this job, you're going to need some rags, safety glasses, rubber gloves, and then we'll need some common hand tools and some special tools. A few things that I want to point out are the seal head setting tool, our seal bullet, bladder removal tool, we have a file, and then we're also going to be using some seal grease, high strength thread lock, and then a ratio right and oil pan. Now, as far as the other parts and consumables go, we're going to use the Tusk seal head. So this thing, there's a bunch of little pieces that make it up, but what's nice about this is it comes already assembled, ready to go, makes the job really easy. And then it also comes with a new circlip. Other than that, we're going to need suspension fluid and some suspension clean. The first thing we need to do is start out with a clean shock. And like I mentioned earlier, we had oil blowing all over this thing. So we need to clean the dirt and oil off of it. And we're just going to do that into this drain pan right here. All right, now that we have the shock cleaned up, what we're going to do is take a couple of measurements, and we need to measure the shock spring length right now. We'll write that down so we can get it back to its original location before we loosen up these lock rings. And then we're also going to count our clickers. So we have the compression clicker on top. We'll go all the way in until it slightly seats, count those clicks, and then we'll back it all the way out. And when you count those clicks, make sure you write them down. Same thing on the rebound, and then we can put this into the vise. Now, I do want to point out when we put this shock in the vise, we're using some suspension soft jaws. So you either want to use these or just some regular soft jaws. And now we're going to loosen up this lock ring. We have a punch and a hammer to do that. I'm just going to spray a little bit of penetrating lube on these threads to help back this spring adjuster down. Next, we'll spin the spring adjuster all the way down to remove some of the tension from the spring. And then we'll install a spring compression tool, and that's going to allow us to access a circlip that holds our spring retainer in place. We'll remove the circlip, spring retainer, and the spring. Next thing we're going to do is remove the Schrader cap from our bladder, and we're going to relieve this pressure. All right, once we've relieved our pressure from the bladder, we can actually remove the compression assembly, and we'll drain all of the shock fluid. So I'm just going to crack it loose, and then I'm going to put this over a drain pan before I remove it all the way. Once we remove it, we're actually going to pump this shaft back and forth, and that's going to help all the oil come out of the shock. And when I remove everything from the shock, I'm just laying all the parts out on a clean rag in order. Now that we have all that oil pumped out, what I'm going to do is reinstall the shock back into the vise on that shock eyelet. I'm going to have the drain pan underneath to catch any residual oil that spills out. All right, the next step is to remove this bladder. And to do that, just to make the job a little bit easier, I'm going to remove the Schrader valve. So we've got this Motion Pro valve core remover. Pull that out of the way. And then I'm going to use a socket, and I'm going to press down on this. It's going to expose a circlip in there. And the reason we're using the socket, we just don't want to damage this end on the bladder cap. I'm going to take a pick and remove the circlip. Now, once the circlip is removed, you want to check this groove and make sure there's no gouges or sharp edges that the bladder could get caught on and ripped. So I'm just going to run this towel, also make sure there's no dirt or debris stuck down in there. If there are any sharp edges, you can just take some emery cloth and lightly clean that up. Now to remove the bladder, what we're going to do is we have this Race Tech bladder removal tool. We'll screw that on where that Schrader valve was, and we'll just pull out on that. The next thing we need to do is remove the shock shaft, and to access everything, we need to remove this cap on the end. It has 2 holes in each side, and we'll just use a punch and hammer and knock it out of place. All right, now that we have this end cap out of the way, I'm going to use a zip tie on the shock shaft and just tie this up out of my way. That's going to make it easier to do the rest of the job. So now that we have this cap up out of the way, I'm going to take the seal head setting tool and we're going to press down on it. And that way we can expose that circlip and get it out of our way. Next, I'm going to take my pick and remove this circlip. You can see there's a ton of dirt in here where this cap was covering, so we need to get some of that stuff out of there. We're going to spray it out and get it as clean as possible before we actually remove the shock shaft. Now I've gone ahead and mounted the shock back into the vise. One thing I want to point out before we remove the shock shaft is if there's any damage where that snap ring groove is, you want to get that cleaned up, use some emery cloth, and that way you don't tear a new O-ring when you're reassembling. So we'll go ahead and remove the shock shaft. Now this shaft was in there pretty tight, and I'm going to have to use a mallet to help drive it the rest of the way out. We're just going to hit the end of the shock shaft right here. Just be careful not to damage anything. You definitely don't want to damage this shaft. It's going to be an expensive replacement if you do. Now I'm going to remove the shock body from the vise, and we're going to drain the rest of the oil down into our drain pan. Next thing you're going to do is mount the shock shaft into the vise. Now we need to remove the nut from the end of the shock shaft. This thing is peened on here, so we're actually going to have to file the end of the shaft just a little bit, and we're only going to be removing from the outside diameter. We don't want to remove any from the top because a rebound piece sits in that end. So the manual wants us to file the end of this shaft so the outside diameter is 10 millimeters wide. And when I'm filing this down, I want to have the shim stack covered up. I don't want to get any metal filings down in there. So what I'm going to do is take a Ziploc bag, I'm going to cut the very end of it off. I'm going to slide this down into place. And I'm going to use a little bit of electrical tape to help keep it in place while I'm filing. So we've got this filed down, so this outside diameter, this is just barely over 10 millimeters, we're at 10.14 right here. We don't want to go too far, so we're going to leave it right there just so we don't damage anything. I'm going to spray the end of this off, get some of these metal shavings out of the way. We'll remove the bag and then work that nut off. So now when we remove this shock nut, what I'm going to do is break it loose. And then since the threads on top might be a little messed up from filing, what you can do is work it back and forth just a little bit and make sure that they're good. That'll help it come off. But with it filed like that, ours is actually just coming right off by hand. Now to keep this shim stack in order, there's tons and tons of little shims right here. I'm going to put a screwdriver on the end of the shaft and just slide the whole thing onto it. That way we don't mess up the order of everything. Lay that down on our bench. After that, we'll remove the old seal head, and we have our cap, the bumper. If your bike is several years old, it's a good idea to replace this while you're in here. At this point, we can start cleaning up everything, and just keep in mind on this shaft, we want to make sure that the chrome isn't worn through at any point. And then the other thing that happens with the shaft, sometimes they can get bent. So if you have either of those two things going on or major scratching going on, then you need to replace this shaft. So on these shim stacks, even though we were really careful to try not to get any metal filings on them, we still did get just a little bit on there. So I'm actually going to remove this rebound side and I'm going to put a zip tie through it. You can do that before you remove it from the screwdriver. And that makes it so we can separate these shims and we don't have to worry about mixing up the order. I'll remove the piston, and you want to note the orientation of the piston. So one side you're going to have larger ports than the other side. So this side right here, this is our rebound side, so I'm just going to lay that down. Now that we have all these parts cleaned up, we want to inspect them for any wear or damage. Now we already talked about the shock shaft, but when you're cleaning it, you want to make sure that any metal shavings that got down this top hole get blown out. So we sprayed that out really well. And moving on to the shock body, you want to look down in here where that piston rides, make sure the anodizing isn't worn off, or again, where the circlips go, make sure that there's nothing that's going to catch an O-ring or that piston when you reinstall it. If there is, you'll need to use some emery cloth, clean it up, and then spray that out again. And just check the body for any damage or cracks. Now moving on to the bladder, you need to make sure that you don't have any damage to the sealing surface right here. And then also on this, if this is deformed or cracked or looks worn out in any way, you want to replace it. I know the service manual will tell you to replace it any time that it's apart. Now moving on to the piston, you just want to make sure there's no visible damage to this piston ring. If it looks worn out or if there's the copper material underneath that's starting to show, then you want to get that replaced. And then as far as these shims go, what you're looking for, you just want to make sure they're clean, and if there's any visible damage to those, they're bent, then you need to replace those. Moving on to the compression adjuster, we're just going to make sure it's clean, replace the old O-rings with new ones, and make sure there's no visible damage to it. And last, this bumper, you want to make sure this is in good condition. If your bike is several years old, it's a good idea to replace it, or if there's any cracks or damage to this as well. Now that we have the parts inspected, we're going to install the shock shaft into the vise, and we'll start reassembling everything. First off, we have this cup at the bottom that goes underneath the bumper. Install the bumper, and then after that we have the cap. Next thing we're going to do is take our seal bullet. We'll install this onto the end of the shaft. This is going to keep us from tearing the new seals on our seal head when we install them. And then I'm going to take some of the suspension grease and I'll put it on the shaft just to help everything go on easy. So the next step, we need to apply some seal grease to our seal head. We've got the oil seal a little bit further up. That bottom one is the dust seal. And we'll take the seal head and we'll install it onto the shock shaft. Next thing I'm going to do is remove the seal bullet, and then we can install our shim stack. When we do that, I'm going to assemble this back onto the screwdriver just to make it easier. And remember the orientation of the piston. Then I'm going to snip these zip ties. Then we can take our shim stack and we'll slide it down onto the shock shaft. Now when you do this, you need to make sure everything's lined up. So you might have to work everything back and forth to get everything to go on. And then once this is on, we can install the shock shaft nut. Now we're using a brand new nut for this, and we're going to use some red Loctite, some high strength Loctite. And then once this nut's torqued down, we're going to peen it in 3 different spots, and we're going to torque it down to 27 foot-pounds. Now as you're going through your cleaning and inspection, it's a good idea to run a thread chaser over these threads on the shock shaft. That way you make sure they're in good condition. And then once this is torqued down, you want to make sure you wipe away any excess Loctite. That way it doesn't get mixed up in that oil. So what I'm going to do now is put a little bit of suspension fluid in our cap. And then I'm going to remove the shock shaft from our vise and we'll install the shock body. And then I'm going to take a little bit of this fork oil. I'm going to put it around the top of the shock body. And then also I'm going to put it on this O-ring on our seal head, and then as well as our piston ring. Put some oil on that, make sure it slides down easy. And then we're going to install this into the shock body. And then again, I'm going to hold this cap up just using a little zip tie. Then once we've done that, we're ready to press this seal head into place. So we'll take our seal head setting tool, press this down till it goes just past that circlip groove. Then we can take our new circlip that came with the seal head, and I'm just going to install that until it snaps into place. It's critical to verify that this snaps into place. If it doesn't, as soon as this gets filled with nitrogen, the shock shaft is going to fly out. So just make sure that's seated really well. Once you've done that, you can pull the shock shaft up until that seal head seats all the way down. And we can cut this zip tie holding the cap up. I'm going to just use a plastic mallet to hit this down into place. And again, we have these two holes on each end. And the way this shock sits on the bike, if you have these holes, so when it's actually installed on the bike that one of these holes is at the lowest point, it helps some of the fluid or any mud or water that gets in there, it'll help it drain out. Next thing we're going to do is take our bladder, and I'm going to apply some shock fluid to it. We're going to just slide this into place. And again, you can use a socket and press this down past that snap ring groove. And then same thing with the circlip on this one. Make sure it's all the way seated. Otherwise, you're going to have that bladder fly out when you fill it with nitrogen. Now I'm just going to use this removal tool, and I'm going to pull the bladder until that cap is seated all the way against that snap ring. Now once that's in there, I'm going to reinstall the Schrader valve. Next thing we need to do is get our compression adjuster ready for assembly. So we're going to install some new O-rings onto it. I'm going to dip them in that shock oil. And we are using new O-rings on these. These are just under the OEM diagrams on our website. And same thing with the shock shaft nut. That's on there as well if you need that. So the next thing we're going to do is let this soak in some oil for a minute while we bleed our shock out. And that way we can get as much air out of this as possible. Next step is to fill the shock body with oil. So we're going to fill this as high as we can and just slowly work the oil into the shock body. If you move the shock shaft too fast, what's going to happen? It's going to spray oil everywhere. You don't want that to happen. And when I do this, I just move it really slow and keep my hand over this hole. And that way, if it does spray up, it'll just go down into the drain pan that I have underneath. Now, once you have most of the bubbles out, I'm just going to move the shock shaft just a little bit at the end of its stroke, and I'm going to watch for the rest of the air bubbles to come out and keep topping off that fluid as I need to until I have all the bubbles worked out of the system. So at this point, I'm looking pretty good for air bubbles. I just want to give one quick tip for final bleeding. You want to make sure that you have all the air bubbles out of your valving stack, and just to get them to open up a little bit, what you can do is put your hand over this opening and hold the shock securely. Again, we don't have this vise very tight on the shock body. We don't want to damage anything. It's really just holding it in place enough to where we can work that shaft. But to get the last little bit out of that valve stack, I'm going to take a mallet and just tap the shock shaft. And that should help open the stack just a little bit and release any trapped air bubbles that were in there. Now that we've made a mess, we're going to top this off again, and then there is one more step to get this bled all the way. What we're going to do loosen the vise just a little bit. Make sure you got a good hold on the shock body. And what we're gonna do is tip it up this way. And then we'll tip it down just a little bit. We're gonna turn this side to side. And that's gonna help any bubbles that were in the bladder or trapped in the shock body rise to the top. Once we've done that, we can set this back into our vise. We're gonna top this all the way off one more time. And the other thing, you wanna make sure that the shock shaft is fully extended as far down as it can go. So once this is back in the vise, I'm gonna hook up our suspension tool and we're gonna pump this up to 7.1 PSI. And what that's gonna do is expand the bladder and it'll help it to have the correct shape. And if there happens to be any little bubbles left in there, it's gonna push them out as well. So once we have the bladder filled up, we'll take this compression assembly that's been soaking and we're gonna quickly swap it over into the shock body and we're gonna tighten that down to 22 foot-pounds. And as you can see, when we swapped that over, we had that shock fluid all the way to the edge since it was overflowing. Yours should look like that. If it doesn't, you want to make sure it's topped off all the way with fluid. So at this point, we have everything sealed up and we're ready to fill this thing with nitrogen. But before I do that, I want to wipe everything down, get all that shock oil off of this. You can use a little bit of suspension cleaner on there as well. We'll remove the shock body from the vise. Then I'm going to release this air pressure we had in our bladder. So now we can fill this shock with nitrogen. Ours is going to be 142 PSI, but if you're working on a different bike, it might be different. So make sure you refer to your model specific service manual. And if you don't have a nitrogen tank, which most people won't, you can take this to your local motorcycle shop and they'll fill it for a small fee. All right, so at this point, we're filled up with nitrogen. What I'm gonna do, press the shock shaft down, make sure that fully extends. If it doesn't, or if it has a spot where it just kind of drops out real quick or whatever, then you know you still have air in the system. But ours is looking pretty good, so we're gonna go ahead and install the spring. Now I do want to point out the spring is directional, so just put it on the same way you pulled it off. So next we'll install that spring retainer. So again, we're using these spring compressors, and when you use these, you want to make sure that these threads are greased up really well. Next we'll take our retaining clip. Make sure that's popped down all the way in its groove. Then we can back off the spring retainers and remove them. So the next thing we need to do is set our spring preload. And again, we measured our spring at the beginning of the video, so we're just going to set it back to that original position. All right, now that we have the spring length set, we're gonna take this lock ring, and if you want, you can do this with it actually on the bike, but since we have it on the bench right now, we'll just lock it down while we're at it. And the last step for us is to set our clickers back to their original positions and clean up our mess. And that's all there is to rebuilding this shock. If you need the parts or any of the special tools, be sure to check out our website. We have a lot of different options on there. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.